My name is Horst von Rakem. It's my privilege to start off this fourth session of the Open BME seminar series. Today's speaker will be introduced by the Department Chair of Case Western Reserve University, Professor Robert Kirsch. My name is Horst von Rakem. I'm also at Case Western Reserve in the Department of Biomedical Engineering. So if you have, whether you have or whether you haven't been to one of these Open BME seminars, this is a seminar series, an online seminar series created by a consortium of 7 of the top BME programs in the country. You see them across the bottom. And our idea was that as a collective, we would have a draw capable of attracting some of the best speakers in the country in our field. And so we've done that. We've brought together this seminar series. If you're in the webinar, you have the opportunity to interact with the speaker. We don't have the conventional chat. What we have instead is the Q&A option. So if you'll notice, there's a Q&A option on your bar across the bottom. And through the Q&A, you're able to ask questions. And feel free to log in and type those questions at any time. You can ask questions. And for the rest of you, you can see what questions are being asked, and you can upvote or even downvote questions that you see if you find that they're similar to what you're interested in or more urgent. And then at the end of the seminar, we'll have a session where we host those questions and see where that goes. I'll probably send a reminder maybe 10 minutes before the end on the chat to encourage folks to start thinking about questions and asking questions. With that, I welcome Dr. Kirsch.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. As Horst said, my name is Bob Kirsch. I'm the Chair of Biomedical Engineering at Case Western Reserve University. And we're really honored and privileged today to have as our speaker Danielle Bassett. She's the J. Peter Skurkanich Professor at the University of Pennsylvania. She has her primary appointments in bioengineering, but she has secondary appointments in a wide range of departments: physics and astronomy, electrical systems engineering, neurology, and psychiatry. She's a Santa Fe Institute external professor. Her bachelor's degree is in physics from Penn State University. She has a certificate in postgraduate studies in physics in the Cavendish Laboratory at the University of Cambridge, PhD in physics from the Cavendish Laboratory at the University of Cambridge, and she did a postdoctoral fellowship at UC Santa Barbara. Dr. Bassett is an amazingly productive researcher. She has 312 peer-reviewed publications, serves on many federal review panels, has at least 10 graduate students, and has mentored many, many other students, from high school students all the way through postdocs. And obviously a sought-after speaker. I counted 27 seminars in 2020. She's also been the recipient of many prestigious awards, and I'll just say some of them, so we're not here all afternoon. But International Biomedical Research Alliance Distinguished Alumni Award, Organization for Human Brain Mapping Early Career Investigator Award, AIMB College of Fellows, Web of Science Group Highly Cited Researcher, Erdos Renier Prize in Network Science, Lagrange Prize in Complex Systems Theory, Popular Science Brilliant 10, NSF Career Award, Distinguished Fellow of the Annenberg Public Policy Center, Harvard Higher Education Leader, ONR Young Investigator, IEEE EMBS Academic Early Career Achievement Award, MacArthur Fellow, Alfred P. Sloan Research Fellow, and the list goes on. Those are the most recent ones. So, Dr. Bassett's work focuses on using network science and complex theory on a number of different kinds of problems. I'll let you talk about that today. And so I'll just say, you see her title is Systems Neuroscience. So please, Danielle.
Well, thank you so much for that very, very, very kind introduction. And I will first see if I can share my screen. Let's see. Okay, wonderful. Yes. So over the last sort of week or two, I've been thinking about what it is that I wanted to share with you. And although systems neuroscience is something that I love, there are also, I think, some topics of work that I've been involved with recently that may be even more broadly relevant to a lot large fraction of the audience. So I wanted to broaden out to the question of what does it mean to be a good scientist? And that might sound like an impossible question to ask and answer, but it's motivated by a class that I am preparing called The Goals of Scientific Inquiry, and also motivating by a class I already teach about curiosity, where we try to understand how scientists ask questions, what kinds of questions are good questions, what makes a problem worth asking or worth answering or worth addressing. So these questions have been floating around in my mind now for several years. And so I thought that I would share a few of my thoughts about this topic with you today. And you'll see how it becomes relevant specifically for BME in a paper that was just published last week. So let's get started. So what do you think about when I ask the question, what does it mean to be a good scientist? Well, some of you in your minds may be thinking, well, if you're famous, you get tenure, you have a legacy that you've left of ideas and discoveries that you've created. Maybe you have a really high salary. Here are some marks of a successful scientist. But I want to ask the question of, are these the right marks? Is being a successful scientist the same as being a good scientist? And I hope that many of you would agree that they're not the same thing. And I'm not using good in the sense of moral. I'm using good in a different sense. So I want to put success aside and say, what is a good scientist? Well, a good scientist is one who discovers the truths of nature. That's what we're here to do, right? Is to understand nature, to understand how to engage with nature, to discover the world around us. So a good scientist is one who can do this discovery. So what makes it hard then to discover the truths of nature? Why is it difficult to be a good scientist? I think there's lots of answers to that question, but I wanted to read you a passage from an article that was written in 1897 by geologist T.C. Chamberlain, who wrote, "The moment one has offered an original explanation for a phenomenon," which is what we all hope to do, right, "which is satisfactory, that moment affection for his intellectual child springs into existence. And as the explanation grows into a definite theory, his parental affections cluster about his offspring and it grows more and more dear to him. So there springs up also unwittingly a pressing of the theory to fit the facts and a pressing of the facts to fit the theory." So what T.C. Chamberlain is saying is that as soon as we arrive at a discovery or an explanation, we as humans tend to put perhaps undue belief in that observation. And so it's one of the simple weaknesses of human nature. If you actually go back a good 200 years from there to 1661, philosopher Joseph Glanville wrote something similar in The Vanity of Dogmatizing. He says, "But to give a more particular account of this gullery, our affections engage us as by our love to ourselves, so by our love to others. Of the former, we have the observable instances of natural disposition, custom and education, interest, and our proper invention. Of the latter, in that homage which is paid to antiquity and authority." So what Joseph is talking about in this part of the book is that we put a lot of emphasis, a lot of respect on the theories that have been created in antiquity or by people who are of authority, and often we assign too much truth to them when there may not be. And then now I want you to fast forward to 1940, where writer Virginia Woolf wrote in The Leaning Tower, "Anybody can make a theory. A germ of a theory is almost always the wish to prove what the theorist wishes to believe. So theories then are dangerous things." And again, this is just indicating that one's affections become attached to a theory, and we often try to create theories that we believe in. So if each of these passages is kind of an indication of something that's difficult or what makes it hard to discover truths of nature, then maybe we can go back to our definition of a good scientist and say that perhaps a good scientist is one who, bracket, is always skeptical of their own assumptions, explanations, models, and theories, and by that skepticism discovers the truths of nature. So we always need to have an open mind to question every one of our assumptions, to question even the theories that we place out there in the literature in our papers. We always have to be skeptical, and that's the way that we can be more likely to see the truth about nature as we move forward. So I want to ask the question of what are some of the common assumptions that we have about scientists, and actually that our culture in the United States and elsewhere has about scientists? Well, scientists are thought to be able to objectively evaluate the merit of science. So we'll often hear someone say, you know, we know good papers when we see them. It's kind of, we are very good at objectively evaluating the merit of science. Number two, scientists can objectively evaluate the merit of other science. So she, he, or they is a thoughtful, rigorous scientist and deserves this award, grant, or promotion. And maybe a third assumption is that scientists can use the method of inductive inference to ensure that they are on an unbiased trajectory in the search for scientific truth. So each of these assumptions kind of lay out a picture of a scientist as very objective and very rational, and typically not affected by typical human weaknesses. So I want to tell you a story now about some work that was started by Jordan Dworkin, who at the time was a PhD candidate in the Department of Biostatistics at Penn. And I think what he wanted to ask is the question, do we continue to cling to those assumptions of a scientist despite emerging data? In other words, let's be skeptical. Let's ask, are these assumptions we should hold, or are they assumptions that we should be skeptical about, question? And so what he decided to do was to think about the problem that is very pervasively described in the literature of gender and racial inequalities in academia and industry. And in prior work, there's been very clear evidence that there are gender and racial inequalities in terms of compensation and grant funding, also credit for collaborative work and teaching evaluations, hiring and promotions, productivity and authorship, and citations. So we can ask ourselves, well, from whence do these inequalities stem? Well, they can stem from lots of different factors. One of them is an explicit bias. So for example, men or people of a particular racial heritage are just better scientists than women or people of another racial or ethnic heritage. Hopefully that's something that we don't hear too often, although I know we hear it more often than we should. The second potential explanation is implicit bias, and this is probably more common, much more common. So this is automatic cognitive processing that presupposes social prejudices and stereotypes. So what might some of those social prejudices and stereotypes be? Well, one is just what we have in our minds as the meaning of a scientist. What is a scientist? Not just a good scientist, but any scientist. There's been a couple really powerful studies over the last few years that have demonstrated that many of us hold assumptions about what a scientist is that we would never verbalize, but are evident in our actions. So for example, many of us hold the assumption that scientists appear masculine. And this is a paper that was published in 2016 from Banchevsky. And what the investigators did is that they took pictures of actual faculty members in STEM at elite universities, and they had participants rate each of those pictures for masculinity and femininity. And then what they did is they asked a separate pool of participants to rate each of those pictures on the likelihood of being a scientist or an early childhood educator. And what they found is overwhelming evidence that the more feminine looking women were assumed to be early childhood educators, despite the fact that all of these pictures were pictures of actual faculty members at elite universities. And another sort of step in this process is that there is a shared assumption by our actions, not necessarily by our words, that scientists not just appear masculine, but actually are men. And this is a paper that was published in 2019 in Nature Geoscience by Dutt et al. They took 1,224 letters written for 452 applicants, averaging 2.71 letters per applicant. And they were written by 1,101 recommenders from 54 countries over the period of 2007 to 2012. So a massive data set. And what they found was that women applicants were only half as likely to receive excellent recommendation letters versus good letters. And the women applicants were commonly described as having a solid skill set, a good track record, strong knowledge. They were described as being intelligent and having an aptitude for learning. In contrast, The majority of the man applicants were described as being brilliant, a rising star, a pioneer, a genius, and a trailblazer. The third and final study I wanted to mention to you indicates that our shared expectation is not just that scientists appear masculine or are men, but also have a man-gendered name. And this paper was written by Corin Moss-Rakusin, who does some wonderful work in the area. It was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2012. And they used a randomized double-blind study of 127 faculty in physics, biology, and chemistry at research-intensive universities. Each of those faculty were handed the application materials of a student who was randomly assigned a name commonly given to a man or to a woman for a laboratory manager position. And when they were given the application materials and that had a woman's name assigned at the top, that person was deemed as less competent, less hireable, offered less mentoring, and offered $3,700 less in salary than the identical application, the same CV with a man's name at the top. So this is important because it's the privilege not just of an identity, but of a name. So going back to this problem, Jordan was thinking, well, what are some of these social prejudices and stereotypes? Well, they are that scientists appear masculine, are men, or have a man-gendered name. So what to do about this and who to do it? It's interesting, actually, when you go through some of this literature to realize that the ongoing conversation, both in the field and around conference room tables and et cetera, is focusing on the role of people in positions of power. So journal editors or grant reviewers in agencies or department chairs or society presidents, despite the fact that many of the imbalances that are observed are caused and perpetuated by researchers at all levels, including me. I'm not a department chair. I'm not a grant agency. I'm not a society president. So one example of an imbalance that can be caused by each of us, and therefore an imbalance that each of us can fix by our own actions, is the imbalance in citations. So people from marginalized groups are broadly undercited by all of us, impacting their visibility, slowing or stalling their career advancement, and precluding an unbiased trajectory in the search for scientific truth, what we were noting as makes a good scientist. So we tend to choose new researcher directions from highly cited papers, and papers by men, and as I'll show you, white men are more highly cited than papers that are written by women or people of color. And thus we tend to answer questions that are posed by particularly white men, and thus trajectories of scientific discovery and the crystallization of collective knowledge is biased away from the ideas produced by minority thinkers. But what is the extent and what are the drivers of that citation imbalance in science, and how can we mitigate it? So just noting it is not enough. Let's see if we can think about, what is it, what's driving it, and then what can we do? So our approach was to examine the authors and reference lists of 61,416 articles published between 1995 and 2018 in neuroscience, including many papers in neuroengineering and systems neuroscience. Other fields are coming soon. These top journals were reported by the Web of Science to have the highest eigenvector scores. So we wanted to take the top journals. Then what we did is that we assigned the term man or the term woman to each author if their name had a probability greater than or equal to 0.7 of belonging to somebody labeled as a man or a woman, according to the Social Security Administration database, or the Gender API, which canvasses 177 countries around the world, so including non-Anglican names. And, or non-English names, I guess I should say. So one important fact before I go any farther is to describe the limitations of the approach. So in our analysis, this term gender does not refer directly to the sex of the author as assigned at birth or chosen later, nor does it refer directly to the gender of the author as socially assigned or as self-chosen. It's simply the probability of having a name that is of the name being assigned to a man or a woman. So it's related to the name bias that I described in the third study earlier. I also want to notice that the binary man-woman gender assignment that we use is not well accommodated to intersex, transgender, and or non-binary identities. And so that's a limitation that we hope to address in future work, but I wanted to note it here. So just to set the stage of the gender of authors over time, the really good news is that the field is becoming more diverse, which is exactly what we would have anticipated given what we see at conferences and among our colleagues. So here what you see in 1995 is that the proportion of papers that have a woman as the first and last author is about 7%, and that's up to 10% by 2018. And the papers that have a man in the first and last author position was 64% in 1995 and is now 50% in 2018. So this is an increase. This increase in the burnt orange color is a rate of roughly 0.6 percentage points per year. Now we took that data and wanted to test the first hypothesis. These next few slides are going to be in the context of gender, and then the next slides after that will be in the context of race and ethnicity. So the first hypothesis we wanted to test was the undercitation of women. For each of 31,418 citing papers between 2009 and 2018, we took the subset of its citations that had been published in one of those top 5 journals since 1995. We determined the gender of the cited first and last authors. We also removed self-citations, and that's defined as cited papers for which either the first or last author of the citing paper was the first or last author. So we wanted to remove that effect and make sure we were just focusing on how authors were canvassing the field outside of themselves. We then calculated the number of cited papers that fell into each of the 4 first and last author categories. So man, man, woman, man, man, woman, and woman, woman. And now the next challenge is, how do we say that one of those groups is being oversighted or undercited? Well, what you can do is that you can say, let's look at the number of papers that are out there in the field in each of these categories. Then whatever that proportion is probably going to be reflected in our reference lists. So in other words, if there are more papers that are written by men, we're going to have a lot more references in our reference lists that are also written by men. So that's just normal, and that would be typical because we're canvassing the field accurately. Now the question is, how do we measure whether we're not canvassing the field accurately? We're kind of skewed in how we're canvassing the field. So that in this first instantiation, what we did was that we assumed that reference lists are simply random draws from the literature. And under that assumption, we calculate the gender proportions among all papers published prior to the citing paper, thus representing the proportion among the pool of papers that the authors could have cited, and we multiplied them by the number of papers cited. So that allows us to get this percent over and under citation, which we define as the observed percent minus the expected percent divided by the expected percent. So man-man papers are oversighted by 11.6%, and women-women papers are undercited by 30.2%. And so that's what you're seeing over here. In the purple bar is the oversightation of man-man papers, and in the burnt orange is the undercitation of the women-women papers. Now, you're probably thinking in your mind, when I create a reference list, I don't randomly draw papers from the literature. There are kind of some reasons why I choose some papers and do not choose other papers. And you're absolutely right. So in the next version of this analysis, we accounted for several characteristics of each paper that could be driving how many citations they get. So for example, the year of publication of the paper, the journal in which it was published, because even among these top 5, some have greater impact than others, the number of authors, whether the paper was a review article or an empirical article, because review papers tend to be cited more than empirical papers, and then number 5, the seniority of the paper's first and last authors. Now, I will note that we don't have the age of each person inside of the database. So as a proxy for their seniority, we used the number of papers that they've previously published. And with that information, we specified a generalized additive model, or a GAM, on the multinomial outcome of paper authorship in the 4 author categories. What we find is that the same trends hold, although the magnitude is decremented from the previous slide. So the man-man papers remain oversighted, now by 5.2%, and the women-women papers are undercited, now by 13.9%, with a total of an average difference of 20% between those 2 categories. So that brings us to now testing hypothesis 2, which is, are there some groups of authors who are driving this over or under citation more than others. And there's prior work in other fields, not in STEM, that suggests that there can be gender differences in patterns of citations. So we split the data out into all of the papers that have a woman in either the first or last author spot or both. And this is their percent over and under citation of the different groups. And then here you have the papers that have a man in both the first and the last author position. And what you can see is that the majority of the imbalance is being driven by this one group, whereas papers that have a woman somewhere in the first or last author position seem to be canvassing the field more equitably. Now, I want to be very frank here that to make sure that my meaning is clear. And to do that, I want to make two clarifications. Number one, the fact that the imbalance that we are observing is driven largely by the citation practices of the man-man teams does not mean that all man-led teams have imbalanced citation practices. And I just want to give you an example. Professor Emeritus at KU Leuven, Guy Urban, has a citation practice that's kind of inverted. So on average, Guy tends to undercite man-man papers. So Guy's reference list citation patterns are in color and the expected are in the dashed lines. So Guy tends to undercite man-man papers and tends to oversight women-women papers. So here's a counterexample just to emphasize the fact that even though a category may be driving an effect, that doesn't mean that every single person in that category is driving the effect. And secondly, the fact that teams that have a woman on them are not driving the imbalance does not mean that all women-led teams have balanced citation practices. And to show you that, I want to give myself as the counterexample. So I didn't even realize that this was something that I should be caring about. And I asked Jordan to go look at all of my citations since from the beginning of when I was publishing. And what he found is that I tend to oversight the man-man papers a little bit, but I drastically undercite the women-women papers, much more than the average person in my field. So this is clearly not something to be proud of, but what is nice about this effect is that once I know about it, I can do something about it. This is something that I can change with every paper that I publish from here forward. So that brings us to testing hypothesis 3. We hypothesized that there would be a decrease in the imbalance over time. And that's because we noticed that the fields are getting more diverse. And so we thought, well, if the fields are more diverse, hopefully the imbalance is getting better. What we actually find is the opposite, and this is quite concerning. The imbalance within reference lists tends to be increasing with time. So here what you see is the percent over and under citation from 2009 to 2018. This is in man-man papers, so you can see that they are increasingly citing other man-man papers and decreasingly citing women-women papers, so that the imbalance is growing, the gender gap is growing. The same is true to a much smaller extent in the papers that have a woman in the first or last author position. So you can see a growth here, but the extent of the growth is much smaller in this group. So I want to note a few explanations and non-explanations here, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. First, the undercitation of women in neuroscience papers may be due to systemic gender bias or to explicit or implicit individual bias relative either to the known gender of an author or to an author's gendered name. We don't always cite people we know. We often cite people who we don't know. And the same is true for race and ethnicity, and I'll show you that in a minute. Number 2, the overrepresentation of men in course syllabi and conference speaking roles is clearly a factor in gender, racial, and ethnic disparity in academia, but this mechanism does not explain the fact that oversitation of the majority was largely driven by the majority. So we all take the same courses, we all go to the same conferences, so imbalances there are unlikely to explain gender differences in the way in which we're citing. Number 3, the growing gender gap does not simply reflect authors' propensity to cite older literature from when the field was more majority dominated, as the expected proportions account for the publication year of the article that is being cited. So that's important. And lastly, the findings are not explained by self-citations or driven by a man-dominated subfield or driven largely by high impact papers. They are really a systemic effect across papers of all impact levels. And for those figures, you can either see the supplement of the paper or ask me in the question and answer period, and I'll show them to you. So now, as part of this story, I want to fast forward to 2020. We had just left Jordan Dworkin asking the question of whether we should be skeptical about our assumptions and kind of the potential that there are stereotypes that are inside of our minds, even if we would never speak them, that could be impacting our behaviors. So now in 2020, I want to talk about Maxwell Berlero, who's a postdoc, or was a postdoc at Penn. And he wanted to ask the question of what about other dimensions of difference or of bias or of discrimination? So to address this new space, particularly in terms of race and ethnicity, we wanted to gather a team around us who could help us to better frame that question. And so we engaged this fantastic team that ranges in expertise from science to policy to race and ethnicity theory to gender theory, brought them all together and said, let's work on this problem together. So what we did is, following on the previous analysis, we assigned an author's race or ethnicity using publicly available probabilistic databases and a deep neural network that learns the relationship between names and racial or ethnic categories. Using the three databases that we used were Florida voter registration data, the US Census, so obviously those are both US centric, and then Wikipedia, which is international. So that allowed us to canvass names more broadly. The approach allows us to estimate the probability distribution across 4 racial and ethnic categories, so Asian, Black, Hispanic, and white, based on each author's first and last names. We now have more data because more time has elapsed, so we have 63,677 articles. The proportion of articles with a person of color as first or last author significantly increased between 1995 and 2019 at a rate of roughly 0.49 percentage points per year. So that's a good note on increasing diversity of authors. Now let's address the same hypotheses that we had for gender, but now in terms of race and ethnicity. So first, are white people oversighted and are authors of color undercited? The answer is yes. So if we use the random draws model that I described earlier, we can estimate that percent over and under citation. In the dark colors here, you see the real data, and in the light colors, you see the null model after we've broken the connection between names and papers. So what you can see is that papers that have a white person in the first and last author position tend to be oversighted by about 8%, and papers that have an author of color in the first and last author position are undercited by 17.2%. Now we can ask the question of which group may be driving these effects more than another. And we see that white authors are driving the effects much more than citers of color. So white authors tend to oversight themselves. White authors like me tend to oversight other white authors by 10.7% and undercite authors of color by 24.1%. That's a steep, 35-point difference. If you look at citers of color, then they tend to oversight white authors by 4.3%, and they tend to undercite papers with an author of color in both positions by 8%. So there's still an asymmetry here, but it's not to the extent that we see in white citers. Now we can move to the sort of more fine-grained model where we take into account the year of publication, the journal of publication, the number of authors, whether it was a research article or a review, and the seniority of the authors. We additionally added the location of the author's institution because geography can be a factor in explaining distributions of people of racial and ethnic heritage. So here what you see is the same estimate of percent over and under citation, but with this generalized additive model. So again, we find that papers with a white author in the first and last position are oversighted by 5.4%, and authors of color are undercited by 9.3%. Again, we see most of it is driven by white citers like me, unfortunately. So oversighting other white papers by 7.1% and underciting the papers from an author of color in those two categories by 14.3%. You can see a small effect in the citers of color, but again, to a much smaller degree than we see in the white citers. The last hypothesis was, again, that change in time. We expected that racial or ethnic imbalance should be decreasing in time, but we actually found that it is increasing. So here on the left-hand side is the reference lists of white citers, and you can see that they're increasingly citing other white papers with a white first and last author, and decreasingly citing papers that have an author of color in the first and last author category. And so that's this burnt orange line. If you look at citers of color, you can still see an expanding gap, but to a much smaller degree than what we see in the white citers. So citers of color are increasingly citing the papers with a white and white first and last author, and they're decreasingly citing papers that have an author of color in both the first and last position, but again, to a much smaller degree than what we see in the white citers. The last question that's probably on your mind in terms of data here is, what about intersectionality? So what is the cost of being a minority gender and a minority race or ethnicity? So to address that question, I'm plotting for you here the race and ethnicity and gender of the first author and of the last author. We have men first and then women second. And the same on the x-axis, men first and then women second. What you can see just by looking at this very clearly is that there's a strong block diagonal structure where papers with men in the first and last author position are cited much more. They're actually on average overcited, whereas papers that have a woman in the first and last author position are on average undercited. So that's the dark blue corner is the undercitation of women, and the red colors in the top left are the overcitation of the man-man teams. But then I want you to focus on inside each of those blocks. You can see marked effects of race and ethnicity. So for example, the papers that are most oversighted are the papers with a white man first and last author. And the papers that are most undercited are the papers with a Black woman first and last author. And the percentage point difference here is from 24% oversighted to 47% undercited, is a difference of 75%. So quite large, quite striking. And as you can imagine, that could have a large impact on people's success in science. And again, remember that these effects are largely driven by the majority race and the majority gender. So at this stage, obviously for intersectionality, I want to quote Maya Angelou. She says, "The truth is no one of us can be free until everybody is free." And that motivates the question of what do we do? What do we do here in 2021? Where do we go? I think first I want to note that the community's response to this data has been overwhelmingly positive. So there was a Brain editorial in 2020, Nature Neuroscience editorial in 2020, a perspective that was written by Adrian Fairhall and Eve Marder, two iconic figures in systems neuroscience. There was also a generalization of the findings to the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience and a Nature Reviews Physics article on the growing citation gap. But I think what I want to focus your attention on as we close here is not necessarily acknowledging the gap, but maybe grappling with the ethics. And I'll be the first to admit that defining an ethics of citation practices is difficult. And we as a field have a choice of what kind of, how we want to define ethics here. We do, I think, acknowledge that writing social inequalities could be accomplished on a number of different models. So one model is the distributional model. And in that model, justice refers to the morally proper distribution of social goods and resources, or in this case, citations. And there are two submodels here. On the equality-based distributive model, citations ought to be allocated to all authors equally, while on the equity-based distributive model, citations ought to be allocated to authors differentially based upon select factors, which might include merit, need, or authority. I think that the distributional model is limited because it emphasizes commodity parity across economies of exchange over differential responsibility for the histories and structures of inequality that we know exist. So I guess I would align myself a little bit more to the difference models, which I've highlighted here in blue, which by contrast recommend acts of reparative justice, which might include affirmative action in citational practices, institutional reform to support citation parity, and disciplinary redress of gender and racial or ethnic bias more broadly. If you're curious about some concrete recommendations for wherever you are in your career in science, we do have a paper that was recently published in Neuron, which offers some suggestions for scientists in different roles. Those who create the science, so the undergrads, graduate students, postdocs who are actually at the bench working or at the computer writing the code. The arbiters of science, so those are the people who are working as journal editors or reviewers, and then the reflectors of science, those who are teaching scientific discoveries to the next generation. We also discuss tools that can increase awareness, software that's available, and ideas for future research. So if you're curious, that's where I would point you. I did want to just mention a few of the tools for mitigating disparity. The really easy ones to describe are the software for gender predictions, software for race and ethnicity predictions, and also a Google Chrome extension that you can download, and it's called Citation Transparency, and it allows you to see predicted gender information from in a Google Scholar search or in a PubMed search. And so that can be kind of a little alert in your mind to make sure not to step over a gender minority when searching for papers to read. The last tool I wanted to mention is the citation diversity statement. And there's an article in Trends in Cognitive Neuroscience where we walk through what a citation diversity statement is. The idea came from Jordan Dworkin and is at the end of his paper. And it looks something like this. So I've color-coded the words so that you can see the statement of motivation, statement of method, statement of results, and statement of limitations. We include this statement at the end of every paper now, right before the reference list, so around the acknowledgments. And it reads, recent work in several fields of science has identified a bias in citation practices such that papers from women and other minority scholars are undercited relative to the number of such papers in the field. Here we sought to proactively consider choosing references that reflect the diversity of the field in thought, in form of contribution, in gender, race, ethnicity, and other factors. First, we obtained the predicted gender of the first and last author for each reference by using databases that store the probability of a first name being carried by a woman. By this measure and excluding self-citations to the first and last author, our current paper, our references contain 8% this category, B% that category, C% this category, etc. The method is limited, and this is important to mention the limitation, in that names, pronouns, and social media profiles that are used to construct the databases may not in every case be indicative of gender identity, and it cannot account for intersex, non-binary, and transgender people. Second, we obtain predicted racial and ethnic category of the first and last author of each reference by databases that store the probability of a first and last name being carried by an author of color. By this measure and excluding self-citations, our reference lists contain F% author of color, G% white author, etc. This method is limited in that names, census entries, and Wikipedia profiles used to make the predictions may not be indicative of racial or ethnic identity, and it cannot account for indigenous and mixed race authors, or those who may face differential biases due to the ambiguous racialization or ethnicization of their name. We look forward to future work that could help us to better understand how to support equitable practices in science. Why do we include a statement like this at the end of our papers? Well, number one, to hold ourselves accountable. We need to actually be frank about the numbers. Number two, to increase global awareness of citation imbalance. And number three, to point future readers to relevant tools for mitigating disparity. In the last little bit of this story, we are now in 2021. I'll note that the journal Trends in Cognitive Science published its first diversity statement in 2020. The Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience now places goals for citation balance on their submission policies page for authors. Cell Press, which publishes 50+ journals, initiated an inclusion and diversity statement for all papers published in all of their journals, and that would just happen in 2021. And many other journals are now including citation diversity statements if it's offered by the authors. But particularly for BME, I wanted to call your attention to this article, which was just published last week, which is called Citation Diversity Statement in BMES Journals. And The abstract is the Biomedical Engineering Society, or BMES, is dedicated to fostering an inclusive environment and strives to represent all members of the biomedical engineering profession. To align with that goal, as editors of BMES journals, we have decided to include an optional citation diversity statement in our paper formats. And a quote from the paper: all BMES journals, Annals of Biomedical Engineering, Cellular and Molecular Bioengineering, Cardiovascular Engineering and Technology, and Biomedical Engineering Education will now encourage authors to include a citation diversity statement within their manuscripts to work towards correcting citation imbalances in the BME literature. So I'm really think it's amazing that the BMES Society has been taking this initiative to address the issue in the local field. So back to those common assumptions and a quick conclusion. Scientists, can we objectively evaluate the merit of science? Not always. Can we objectively evaluate the merit of other scientists? Well, there's evidence that we have implicit biases that may not allow an objective evaluation. And lastly, scientists can use the method of inductive inference to ensure that they are on an unbiased trajectory in the search for scientific truth. Again, not necessarily. Scientists are human and are subject to human weaknesses, which include both explicit and implicit bias. So what if we were to truly see and accurately value the work of minority thinkers? How much more effective would the trajectory of science be? How much more quickly and more fully would we discover the truths of nature? How much closer would we be to the model of a good scientist? That's kind of what keeps me up at night. So I'd like to acknowledge the people who were important in the first paper, mostly Jordan Dworkin, who led the work, in addition to Perry Zern, who works in gender theory in the philosophy department of American University, Kristen, Lynn, Dale, Taki, and Aaron. And then the broader group that was involved in the effort to understand racial and ethnic imbalance in citation practices. I'd also obviously like to acknowledge the funding that supported the work. And with that, thank you so much for listening, and I'm excited to take questions.
Just hold on 1 second. Okay, here we go. Oh, there we go. All right, thank you very much, Danielle. Fantastic. We have a number of questions. We'll see how we can get through them. So the highest, well, now it's the tie, but what is the conclusion? Is the sex of the author now more important than the scientific significance?
That's an interesting question. I think the conclusion is that we appear as a field to be stepping over the work of minority thinkers and therefore not including that work to guide our thought process about the question or the problem, the question we're trying to ask or the problem we're trying to address. And so that suggests that we should, if we are searching for truth, if we're searching to understand nature, if we're searching for discoveries, then we should be canvassing the ideas of all individuals, not in a biased way to only listen to some and not others. So it is to see the field of science and see the discoveries of our peers in an equitable way.
Is your model available so that I can see how my citation numbers look?
Yep, it is. It's available on our website. If you go under the diversity tab, you'll find a link there. You can also, it's a few slides, you can go to the recording of this talk and it's a few slides ago when I said tools for mitigating disparity, there were links there.
So Victoria Laney, one of our case BME students, says, thank you for your talk. It was extremely informative. Have you looked at the breakdown of citations coming from predominantly white institutions versus minority serving institutions? Maybe I'll start with that one. It's a multi-part question.
Yeah, no, we have only taken institution as a covariate in the regression, so to remove the effective institution. We haven't explicitly studied it as a variable of interest, but I agree with you that it could be very interesting to study it as a variable of interest. We haven't done that yet.
So the second part of that is whether the decrease in people of color, in citing other people of color, is correlated with the increase in people of color author attendance and participation in I don't know what PWI is. Yeah.
Yeah, Victoria, can you say what PWIs is? I apologize for not knowing.
Yeah. I can, if I click answer live, can she speak, Horst? I think. Just
predominantly white institution. PWI is predominantly white institution. Okay, sorry. Thank you for that question. I'm learning as we go here. So whereas whether the decrease in POCs citing other POCs is correlated with the increase in POC author attendance and participation at PWIs, I do not know, but that is a really fascinating question, and something we can certainly address in these data. And that would be a really interesting thing to do. Yeah, thank you for the suggestion. We haven't done it yet.
Okay, thank you so much for your talk. Have you looked into, maybe you can read that one. It's, do you have these up?
Have you looked into how much of the discrepancy in POC citations is due to a lack of citations of papers from international institutions, particularly those in non-white countries? Again, we haven't addressed the geography except to try to remove that effect and just see what's left. But I do think that geography is going to have an impact. I will note that I didn't have time because of the sort of length of this talk, but in both papers, we show that our co-authorship networks explain some of the variance in these patterns. So in other words, if an author tends to have a predominantly women-based co-authorship network, that person tends to cite in a way that's more balanced. Whereas if your co-authorship network is composed only of men, then you tend to cite in a less balanced way. And the same with with race and ethnicity. So if your co-authorship network is mostly white people, you tend to cite mostly white people. If your co-authorship network has a lot of people of color in it, you tend to cite more equitably. So one really interesting question is, if we take the initiative or have mechanisms to encourage collaborations among people of different genders, races, and ethnicities, that may have an impact on citation behavior moving forward. So that's a really interesting prediction that one could test in future years as this all evolves.
So the next question basically says, you're assuming that that there's equal number of papers from a wide variety of authors, genders, and races. Is this actually the case? Isn't the real solution basically to improve representation among the scientists and perhaps not penalize citation count?
That's an interesting question. So the point of our work is that even when you increase representation, so we're seeing that the number of papers that are published by minority genders and races and ethnicities is increasing with time. So representation is up and it's going up, keeps going up, right? So even with improving representation, that doesn't really explain or predict how we engage with that work. And what's actually happening is that we're not engaging with that work. And remember, this is work that's in the top 5 journals in the field, right? So this is excellent work to begin with. In fact, if you just compare a paper from 2 different groups published in the same top tier journal, we're still seeing these effects. So this suggests to me that it's not about representation. Representation doesn't mean engagement. These are really different things. And so I think what's important is to, again, just be aware of the work of our colleagues who may be of a minority gender or minority race and ethnicity. Be aware of it, understand it, and ask whether it's relevant to your work.
Okay. Do you think that search engines also are partially responsible? Oh, the scene keeps jumping on me for this inequality of citation.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. And I'm not sure, it has been something that's been raised in previous conversations. I'm not sure how to test whether that could be a factor. I think it would be interesting to try to understand whether it is, but I don't know how to test that experimentally.
Okay, Matt Trish. Hey, Matt. Have you looked at heritability? Do trainees of good or bad citers follow the trends of their mentors?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I also just want to really first put up front again myself as the poor example in the slide deck. So I wouldn't, the people who are citing inappropriately are not bad people. They may just not be aware, right? And as soon as I was aware of this issue, now I cite differently. So I just want to make sure that we put that up front. But the second thing is there heritability? That's a great question. I don't know the answer to it, but you were a fly on the wall in my conversation with my postdoc last week, because that's exactly what we were discussing is because we often learn about the field and about the work in the field from the people around us, right? And so if there's a biased understanding of the field or the players in the field, then around us, then we may see that too, or we may inherit it. So that's a really interesting question. We do have some ideas about how to test it, but haven't yet.
If I can jumped on me again. If I can paraphrase the next one, it was about how much of this might be due to papers, citations from international papers, and not necessarily U.S. ones, I suppose.
Yeah, if we restrict the data set just to US papers or papers from authors who are at US institutions, we see the same effects. So it seems to be present in both cases.
Okay. What do you hypothesize is causing the increases in disparity in citations for underrepresented minorities over time? Did you account for the increased participation of these groups over time?
We observe the increased participation of these groups over time, but the citations remain decreasing. So why is that the case? One observation, you can check out the bioRxiv preprint. The paper is currently in revision. It's one observation that we made is that co-authorship networks appear to be much more racially and ethnically segregated today than they were in 1995. And that's surprising to us. But because we're also seeing that co-authorship networks are somewhat predictive of one's citation practices, that could be a factor. So that definitely deserves additional investigation to understand why that would be the case.
Okay. I think we have time for maybe one more here. Dustin Tyler, have you looked at the participation of these different diversity groups at key society and meetings and other places where science is socialized? It seems that part of the reference literature is a product of the familiarity with the author.
So we have not looked at the participation of these individuals at society meetings where science is socialized. That's a really interesting question. How science is, the interplay between science and society here is very interesting and probably really important for understanding what's going on, but deserves additional studies. So there's also been a suggestion from others that we study which papers are being discussed on Twitter and whether there are gender or racial and ethnic differences in who posts about their papers on Twitter, or how much they post about them, or the ways in which they post about them. So I think that there is perhaps more work to do to understand how the discussion of work in society, whether it's at a meeting or online, could potentially impact global awareness of that work. But I also guess I would end with saying that I feel personally that I don't need to sit back and wait to be made aware of work by minority scholars. I would prefer and attempt to actively educate myself. Because it's also not just about let me do my work and at the end when I write my paper, make sure that I cite appropriately. It is, I want to have my ideas guided by all other ideas equitably. I want to not be biased in the way that I ask scientific questions. And so that requires a lot of responsibility on my side to educate myself. And so that's something that I think is maybe the take home in my mind.
There are a lot of great questions, but I think we're going to have to cut it off here. There's things about Asian names, telling gender and Asian names. There's pushy men making themselves first and last author when maybe it's not appropriate. There's a lot of good questions here, but I'm sorry, we're going to have to stop here. Dr. Bassett is going to meet with some of our students now, and I'm sure I speak for everyone and say thank you very much. That was really a
Thank you.
fascinating, objective way of looking at this problem, and I was very impressed. So,
thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So thanks again, and I guess this concludes the seminar. So, you and Horst can figure out how to meet up with the students, right?
Sounds good.
All right. Thank you, everyone. See you next time.